Okay, so I knew I forgot to mention something in the last video when I was talking about the structure of long bones. And if you remember, I was talking about the epiphyses, which remember the epiphyses are the expanded ends of a long bone. The middle slender shaft is the diaphysis. And in the epiphyses, we'll have a proximal epiphysis, which will articulate with the trunk of the body. So this is the head of the femur. This would articulate at the hip joint. So this is the proximal epiphysis, whereas this is the distal epiphysis because this would help make up the knee joint. Now, a structure I forgot to mention that you'll find on the epiphyses is this structure called articular cartilage. So articular cartilage is hyaline cartilage, and it surrounds the epiphyses of long bones. Why? Because these epiphyses create joints. And what happens at joints? Movement, okay? And so we don't want bone grinding on bone, especially like on our hip joint, right? There's going to be a lot of weight being transferred from our hips into the femur. And so we don't want bone grinding on bone. So therefore we have the structure called articular cartilage made up of hyaline cartilage. And if you remember hyaline cartilage, when we talked about that in chapter 4, hyaline cartilage is very glassy. It's very smooth, right? Very smooth in appearance. It's tough and rigid enough to be sturdy, but also somewhat flexible enough. But the key here for the articular cartilage, why hyaline cartilage makes up this structure called articular cartilage, is because of hyaline cartilage being so smooth. And so this allows the bones at this joint to be able to just kind of glide past one another, and we don't have bone grinding on bone. So I forgot to mention articular cartilage, which is made of hyaline cartilage. It's just given a special name, articular cartilage, because it's found surrounding the epiphyses of long bones, which create joints or articulations, okay? All right, so I just wanted to make sure and go back and talk about that. Now let's talk about the extracellular matrix of bone. Remember in chapter 4, we talked about bone as a connective tissue. And what were some of the general characteristics of connective tissues? It has abundant extracellular matrix, and cells are scattered throughout. They're not tightly compacted like what we see in epithelial tissues, right? So abundant extracellular matrix and fewer cells scattered throughout the abundant extracellular matrix. And we see that in bone, but the extracellular matrix of bone is very unique and unlike any of the other connective tissues because it's made up of both an inorganic matrix as well as an organic matrix. So the bulk of the extracellular matrix, 65% of the total bone's weight, will be this inorganic matrix. This is going to be our calcium salts, which make the bone very hard and rigid, okay? Makes it the hardest substance in the body. And then the remaining 35% of the extracellular matrix will be this organic matrix. And this is all the stuff that when we normally think of the extracellular matrix of connective tissues, this is the usual extracellular matrix components like collagen fibers. We do see collagen in bone, and we'll see why in just a second, but collagen fibers, glycoproteins, right? We'll see that in the organic component of the extracellular matrix. So again, the inorganic matrix, it's going to be predominantly calcium salts. The calcium with the majority of the calcium salts will be calcium phosphate salts. Okay, so bones actually store large quantities of phosphorus as well. So bones can be used for maintenance or homeostasis of calcium as well as phosphate levels in the body. And these calcium phosphate salts actually they bind together to form an extremely rigid crystalline structure, and that's what enables the bone to be hard and rigid. And so it makes it very strong and resist compression, okay? So these calcium phosphate salts form a crystalline, extremely organized structure called crystals. Okay. And then the inorganic matrix, you'll also see stores of bicarbonate, potassium, magnesium, and sodium. So it does store other minerals that can be released into the blood as electrolytes. Bicarbonate, this is a key player in acid-base balance in the blood. That's why if you previously saw bone being mentioned as in the functions, right? We talked about the skeletal system playing a role in electrolyte balance as well as acid-base balance, and that's because of this bicarbonate here. So that's the inorganic matrix. Again, majority of the inorganic matrix will be these calcium phosphate crystals, okay, which makes it very hard. The organic matrix has a special name. It's called osteoid. An osteoid will consist of collagen fibers, proteoglycans. Now, I won't ask all of this thing, but if you remember, you should know that the organic matrix will be collagen for sure. You need to know that collagen is a component of the osteoid, which is the organic matrix. But if you remember when we talked about extracellular matrix back in the beginning of chapter 4, proteoglycans, glycosaminoglycans, glycoproteins, these are all substances that have charges associated with them. And you'll see that these glycosaminoglycans and proteoglycans create, remember the charges, they draw water into the connective tissue. They do the same thing in bone. So these organic matrix substances will draw water into the bone, and that helps bone resist compression, all right? The collagen, which is the predominant protein fiber of the organic osteoid, right? The collagen will help. So if you remember, when you think collagen, you should think great tensile strength. It resists pulling or stretching forces, so it's very strong. And it does that here in bone. So having collagen being a predominant component of the organic matrix, the osteoid, collagen allows bone to resist twisting as well as resist pulling and stretching forces, all right? And the organic matrix is just as important to the structure and function of bone as the inorganic matrix component, which makes the bone hard and rigid. And we see that here. So here are normal bones. If you were to dissolve the inorganic matrix, so if you were to remove the calcium phosphate crystals, which makes the bone hard, then the bone is incapable of resisting compression. And you can see that especially the bones of, like, say, our lower limbs, as soon as our weight is bearing down on those bones, look what would happen. They're soft. They're still pretty strong. You wouldn't be able to pull this apart, okay, because it still has abundant collagen. But you can see that as soon as a compressive forces, like the weight of your body bearing down on these bones, they will wrap up like this because they can't resist compression, and they can bend like this. Whereas if you were to remove the organic matrix, so all the like collagen in the osteoid, but just keep the inorganic part. So remember, the inorganic part is the calcium phosphate crystals. It makes the bone very hard. Well, if you remove the organic matrix and all you have left are the calcium phosphate crystals, then it makes the bone, yeah, it's hard, but it can also shatter quite easily, right? So it makes it brittle. It's hard, but brittle and shatters easily. So both the organic matrix as well as the inorganic matrix is required and important in giving the bones their stability, the ability to resist compression, their hardness, their ability to resist pulling forces and twisting forces, okay? So let's talk about the bone cells, the cells that we find in bone. And bone is dynamic, so it's not a static organ where, once bones are formed, that's it. They're just dead and they don't change. No, bone is constantly changing, again, because remember, bone is involved in homeostasis of calcium phosphate levels. So bone's constantly being built up, broken down, that's called remodeling, based on what the needs of the body are at that time, right? If you start exercising a lot and there's more tension applied to bones, bones grow stronger. If you are bedridden and you don't exercise a whole lot, well then bones aren't necessarily important, and so you may start to break down bones. So they're dynamic, they're living, it's made up of living tissues, right, that are constantly changing, okay? Building new bone, breaking down old bone. So let's go through these 3 cell types that we find in bone. First being osteoblast. And all of these bone cells, by the way, the osteoblast, osteocytes, and osteoclasts are all found in, think of them, these cells are sandwiched in between the periosteum and the bone, right, the osseous tissue, as well as sandwiched in between the endosteum and the bone, all right? So we find these cells lining the external surface of the bone and the internal surface of the bone, sandwiched between those connective tissue coverings called the periosteum and the endosteum, okay? So let's talk about osteoblast first. So here, this would be the collagen fibers of, say, okay, look, so it says, here's the periosteum. These would be the connective tissue collagen fibers. Here are the osteogenic cells in the osteoblast. And then over here somewhere would be the osseous tissue of the bone itself, okay? Osteogenic cells, these are stem cells. These have the ability to, so you can see they're kind of flattened-ish cells, okay? The osteogenic cells mean they're stem cells, and they have the ability to proliferate as well as differentiate into osteoblast if there are the correct chemical signals from the body, right? So if the body needs to start stimulating bone production, then there will be appropriate chemical signals that will reach these osteogenic cells. These osteogenic cells can then proliferate, make more of themselves, as well as differentiate or specialize into these osteoblasts. And so osteoblasts are younger bone-forming cells. So they are bone-forming cells. And younger meaning they're very metabolically active. They're constantly laying down the extracellular matrix. So they're constantly secreting the components of the inorganic and the organic matrices, okay? So these osteoblasts, remember, you think osteo means bone. Blast is a younger, very metabolically active cell. So these are bone-forming cells. And they are responsible for bone deposition. So they secrete the components of the organic matrix and assist in the formation of the inorganic matrix. Now, over time, these osteoblasts essentially surround themselves in the bone matrix, right? So the extracellular matrix of bone. Now, they don't completely get surrounded. They will actually, just like we saw in cartilage, when we saw those chondrocytes in a little lacunae, it's like a little house, a little space around the cell, because if the cells were just completely surrounded by bone, then they would die. So there has to be a little space for them around the cell. But essentially, they enclose themselves in the bone matrix, and once they do that, they're no longer forming bone. They're mature bone cells called osteocytes, and their function really is just to help maintain the bone. They don't form more bone, they just maintain the bone that already exists, okay? And so here, this is what happens over time. So here's our osteogenic cells right here that have the ability to proliferate and differentiate into osteoblast. Over here, these guys are mature osteocytes. They're no longer very metabolically active. They don't deposit bone anymore. They're completely surrounded by the bone matrix, except for the little green space that's around these cells. That green space is their lacunae, right? Their lacunae, which is a cavity that these osteocytes are located in, okay? But their job is really just to maintain the bone extracellular matrix. They don't deposit more. And so this is an osteocyte. And it looks pretty dramatically different from a younger osteoblast because you see these long cytoplasmic extensions. All right, and these long cytoplasmic extensions you can see actually connect to and allow for communication between osteocytes. So they're not secluded. Osteocytes aren't completely secluded. They connect to and can communicate with neighboring osteocytes. Okay, and remember that I'll talk about that again. They have these little tiny channels that connect them. We'll talk about those channels in the next video. All right. So this is just showing, again, osteogenic cells can, under the correct chemical signals from the body, can proliferate and differentiate into these bone-forming osteoblasts. They are very metabolically active, and they're going to secrete the extracellular matrix of bone. Eventually, they change their shape, forming these cytoplasmic extensions. They completely surround themselves with bone matrix. And then they are now mature osteocytes. They no longer lay down new bone, but they just maintain the current bone matrix. And then the last cell type, so if we have cells, we've talked about two cells, cells that lay down or form bone, a cell type that maintains bone. Well, if we're constantly breaking down or building bone depending on the needs of the body, we need a cell that can actually break down bone. And these are osteoclasts. So think osteobone, clast, think like clash, like clats. To me, that just sounds like breaking clasts, right? So osteoclasts are cells that are responsible for bone resorption. And what resorption means is essentially breaking down. So it breaks down the bone matrix. So I'm going to show you this picture to talk about them. So these are huge cells. They're really large. If you look at them on a microscope slide, they're huge. They're multinucleated. So if you look here, there are multiple nuclei in these super large cells. That's how they become so large, is they form by a fusion of multiple cells together. Now here, this would be the, up here, these are the collagen fibers of the periosteum. This could also say collagen fibers of the endosteum, right? Because remember, these bone cells, osteoblasts, osteocytes, and osteoclasts, can be found in the periosteum, kind of sandwiched between the periosteum or the endosteum and the bone itself. So here, this is the periosteum. Here's the bone. Here's our osteoclast sandwiched in between, okay? So what osteoclasts do is, if you kind of look, the side that's facing the bone has what's called a ruffled border. Why would this border be ruffled? Well, this increases the surface area of the cell. More surface area means more stuff that can be secreted or reabsorbed from the osteoclast, or reabsorbed from the broken down bone. So this ruffled border increases the surface area. So what do osteoclasts do? They're going to secrete two substances. They'll secrete hydrogen ions as well as enzymes. Hydrogen ions, when you think of hydrogen ions, what do you should immediately think back from chapter 3, I believe it's chapter 3 or chapter 2, it may have been chapter 2, when we talked about pH. Hydrogen ions, that's what pH is. It's a measure of hydrogen ions. And if you have more hydrogen ions present in a solution, what does that do to the pH? More hydrogen ions lowers the pH. A lower pH means it's more acidic. So when these osteoclasts get the appropriate chemical signals from the body that we need to break down bone, say calcium levels in the blood are low, we need to release calcium. Well, these osteoclasts will release hydrogen ions, creating an acidic environment here, and that acid will actually degrade the inorganic component of the matrix, right? So the inorganic part of the bone matrix will be broken down because of these hydrogen ions that make the environment more acidic. Now, the enzymes that get secreted by the osteoclast, The enzymes will break down the organic matrix of the bone matrix, all right? So the enzymes break down the organic matrix, right? Hydrogen ions create an acidic environment that breaks down the inorganic matrix. Enzymes break down the organic matrix. And what's interesting is like all the components that get released, right? So once the bone matrix starts to be resorbed or broken down, the calcium, the phosphates, the sugars, the proteins, the amino acids that make up the proteins, like collagen protein, right? All these components that get released from the broken down bone will actually be absorbed by the osteoclast first, and then eventually it will all get deposited into the blood, right? So again, this ruffled border increases the surface area. More surface area of this plasma membrane means more substances that can be secreted, more substances that can be absorbed.